This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 537th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Archetypal Character Arcs, Part 4, the Queen Arc. So what happens after the happily ever after? This is a question we often ask, but seldom explore. As discussed in previous weeks, the two archetypal character arcs that begin the cycle of 6 life arcs are the maiden and the hero. Together, they account for a great majority of the archetypal stories we read and view, and together they act to resolve the protagonist's initiation into adulthood, which often ends, quote-unquote, happily, with the protagonist's reintegration into a meaningful position of work and relationship within the larger tribe or kingdom. But the vague ever after part of the phrase is only there if we choose not to follow the character into the life arcs of the second act of her life. Just as the two arcs of the first act were characterized as representing the first 30 years of the character's life, the next two arcs can be thought of as representing the second act and comprising the next 30 years, approximately from the ages of 30 to 60. Obviously, what we see represented here is a more mature phase of life, an unequivocally adult phase. The protagonist has put behind her the challenges of individuation and initiation on her way to discovering healthy relationships, building her own family, and investing herself in meaningful work. But as any of us chronologically in the second act can attest, the adventure is far from over. The challenges of the first act were primarily about the character's relationship with self and her ability to integrate the separate parts of herself. The second act arcs of Queen and King are about relationship with others. In The Virgin's Promise, Kim Hudson mentions the many options for how this relationship may be dramatized. She says, the mother and the king know their power and must now enter into a relationship to use their power well and gain meaning in their life. This relationship can be between a man and a woman, a mother or a father and a child, and a woman or a man and his or her community. This union brings a form of wholeness. So if the overarching theme or challenge of the first act was fear, then the second act is power. The Queen, particularly, is an arc about learning to responsibly accept and use one's power in relationship and in authority. The static archetype that lives between the hero and the queen is that of the parent. After returning from the hero's adventures of the quest, the initiated adult settles down and starts a family, whether literally or symbolically. But the love the hero learned in his arc is not enough to bear up the queen's growing burdens of responsibility. If she is to continue her maturation and grow her abilities to defend, enable, and direct the next generation of maidens and heroes in their own journeys, then she must grow beyond the role of loving parent into the true leadership of the subsequent static archetype of ruler and its following arc of the king. For me personally, the Queen arc has been one of the most exciting to explore. As I've been outlining the sequel stories to my Portal Fantasy Dreamlander, I've been challenged to ask what we all ask sooner or later. What happens to the hero after the hero's journey? Is it just another hero's journey? Instinctively, I think we all know that true characterization demands that the sequel for any hero must offer an even deeper journey into the protagonist's self. Now, as always, before we officially get started with this, I want to emphasize 2 important reminders that hold true for all of the arcs we'll be studying. Reminder number 1, the arcs are alternately characterized as feminine and masculine. Primarily, this indicates the ebb and flow between integration and individuation, among other qualities. Together, all 6 life arcs create a progression that can be found in any human life, provided we complete our early arcs in order to reach the later arcs with a proper foundation. So in short, although I will use feminine pronouns for the feminine arcs and masculine pronouns for the masculine arcs, the protagonist of these stories can be of any gender. And reminder number 2, because these archetypes represent positive change arcs, they are therefore primarily about change. The archetype in which the protagonist begins the story will not be the archetype in which she ends the story. She will have arced into the subsequent archetype. The queen arc, therefore, is not about becoming the queen archetype, but rather arcing out of it into the beginnings of the king arc, and so on. Queen represents who the hero has become after returning from the quest. She represents not just someone with the capacity for heroism, but also someone with a deep connection and compassion for those she previously saved, for her family and community. That community, her domestic world, is a rich and joyous place full of love and nurturing, where she has found purpose and joy in guiding the children and directing the maidens. But it is easy for her to lose herself at the hearth, so to speak. It is easy to lose herself in this loving world and in the headiness of having so many adoring dependents, her children, literal or metaphorical, with whom she deeply identifies. Fortunately, as in all stories, a catalyst arrives to prompt her growth into the next phase of her life, and her children into theirs. The kingdom comes under threat from outside forces, and the current leadership proves itself incapable of protecting her family. In her book, The Heroine's Journey, which presents a model that aligns closely with the Queen arc, paranormal romance author Gail Carringer states, "A key moment in any heroine's journey is that precipitating fracture of family that will drive her into action." Whatever is a queen to do? The hero had to realize that love creates meaning, but the queen must recognize that love isn't enough. There must also be order, else all is chaos. The children will all be spoiled brats who never leave their mother's breast, never graduate from maiden to hero. And yet, there is a tremendous part of her that cannot bear that her children should grow up and leave her. Like all of the positive archetypes, she stands on the narrow center point between her negative poles, the Snow Queen and the Sorceress, who are often the villainous representations of corrupted power whom the maidens, specifically, must overcome in their stories. Instead, the queen must now mature away from her own needs for connection. She must mature into the comparatively lonely role of the leader, willing to entrust responsibility to her able subordinates. Part of her challenge in becoming king is letting her children grow up. Because she enjoys being queen, she doesn't necessarily want to become king. Relinquishing her children feels like a death, and indeed symbolically is. In Sacred Contracts, Carolyn Mace discusses the inherent relationship focus of this archetype. Challenges related to control, personal authority, and leadership play a primary role in forming the lessons of personal development that are inherent to this archetype. The benevolent queen uses her authority to protect those in her court and sees her own empowerment enhanced by her relationships and experience. Unlike the maiden and hero, who resist their incumbent evolution out of fear of the powers that be, the queen resists change because she is content. She likes where she's at and feels like she's earned it. But necessity calls. Her brood grows too big. They need guidance. They need to be released from the home into the kingdom and beyond. She must transform and rise up to face the threats against the kingdom by becoming the leader the kingdom needs. Her love must grow from enveloping and protecting to enabling and ordering. Her fear of becoming king is not because she lacks the qualities, power, will, intelligence. Her fear is that in giving up on her queen identity, she can no longer be identified with her children or they with her. No longer can she throw herself in front of a wayward child and tell the Punisher, "Take me instead." Now she must view her children as subjects and become, instead of their shield, an impartial arbiter. The catalyst that drives the queen into action and growth is represented by an exterior threat to the kingdom, symbolic invaders. But the true antagonist within her story is the kingdom's lack of a mature and healthy leader to combat this threat. The queen will start out appealing to what leadership exists, only to discover the throne is symbolically empty. It is occupied by either a puppet or a tyrant, and presents as great a threat to the kingdom from within as does the invader from without. Despite her initial attempts and desires to work within the existing system, the queen must eventually realize that the only way to protect her children is to rise up and do it herself. She does this not out of a personal need, as does the maiden, or a desire for glory, as does the hero, but in defense of what she loves. Carringer states, while our hero tends to move toward objects and acquisitions of power, a supernatural sword, magic amulet, and so on, the heroine's descent is precipitated by a rejection of divine power or defined social role as a result of a familial connection or relationship network being taken from her. This can also be seen as a loss of identity, or it can manifest in a more concrete way, such as an actual disguise. The maiden and hero arcs evolve the character into personal responsibility. Queen, and later the king arcs, now demand that the character evolve into relational and social responsibility. No matter what quote-unquote invasion may be threatening in the story's outer conflict, this is the central thematic focus of the Queen's arc. Hudson says, the mother, the king, represent the middle stage of life, and all face the challenge of entering into a relationship with another. Once again, it's important to note that the language used throughout this series is by nature archetypal. We speak of queens and kingdoms and invaders, but these concepts can be represented just as immediately in contemporary stories with none of these trappings. One of my favorite examples of the Queen arc is the baseball comedy, A League of Their Own, which takes place against the backdrop of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League during World War II. In it, the protagonist Dottie, played by Gina Davis, reluctantly undertakes a Queen arc, growing into mature leadership, cleverly outmaneuvering the threats from without that would shut down the league, and the threats from poor leadership within, the alcoholic, apathetic manager, played by Tom Hanks, and eventually she demands individual responsibility from her subjects, the other players, and particularly her maiden archetype younger sister. Unlike the hero, who, in order to properly fulfill his growth challenges, must win alone, the Queen's growth arc demands she enable others to work with her. She will start out in a more heroic mindset, wanting to do it the way she did it before and spare everyone else the conflict, but she must learn that she cannot, that she is only able to save her family by enabling them to take up arms alongside her. Carringer again. When in possession of political power, the heroine acts more like a military general or a really, really good general manager, getting help, recognizing the strengths in others, and doling out tasks and requests for aid accordingly. Her objective is often to build and empower in the form of community, city, family, love. Now, for easy reference and comparison, I will be sharing some scannable summations of each arc's key points. The Queen's story is a battle. The Queen arc is about protector to leader. She moves from the domestic world to the monarchic world. The Queen's symbolic setting is the kingdom. The Queen's lie versus truth is control versus leadership, or only my loving control can protect those I love versus only wise leadership and trust in those I love can protect them and allow us all to grow. The Queen's archetypal antagonist is the invader and/or the tyrant. The Queen's relationship to her own negative shadow archetypes are either the Snow Queen finally acts in love for her children by accepting responsibility, or the Sorceress learns to submit her selfish love to the greater love of responsibility. And the Queen's relationship to subsequent shadow archetypes, as represented by other characters, could be that she empowers the puppet or overcomes the tyrant with her power. Now, following are the structural beats of the Queen arc. The first act is the domestic world. Beginning, dangers of dependency. The Queen is fulfilled, caring for her growing children, but she is in danger of identifying herself too much with her children's dependency upon her, and therefore of binding her children to her too tightly instead of allowing them to grow up and individuate via their own maiden arcs. Inciting event, enemies at the door. The domestic world is threatened when enemies arrive from without. Unfortunately, there is no one fit to defend the kingdom from these invaders. It could be there is no king, or the king is incompetent and or corrupt, or the current king is arcing into crone, to be discussed next week, and recognizes he must name and train a successor. Whatever the case, the king will prove unwilling or unable to defend the kingdom from the invaders, and the queen's realm will be threatened by this void of leadership. This call to leadership will be countered by a refusal when the queen resists immediately taking charge of her family's defense and instead chooses to believe she can convince the existing king to do what is necessary. The second act is the monarchic world. First plot point, entering the castle. In order to entreat the king, the queen reluctantly leaves her beloved domestic world and enters the monarchic world of the castle. She demands from him protection for her children. She may not immediately despair of the king's ability to defend the kingdom, but she accepts that she must do something herself, perhaps at the bidding of the king, who is either trying to fob off his own responsibility onto her or simply fob her off. First pinch point, children clamor for action. The queen's children aren't content with her diplomatic attempts to assure their safety against the enemy. They believe in their mother more than they believe in the king, and they want her to take charge and help them defend the hearth that she has taught them to believe in and cherish. She resists this, neither wanting to leave her family for the throne, nor wanting her children to take up arms. She continues to hope and work for the king's enablement against the invaders. Midpoint, leading the charge. Finally, the queen finds herself with no choice but to take charge herself and assume leadership/kingship in pushing back the invaders. She comes to a moment of truth in realizing that her love alone is not enough to protect her children. More than that, she cannot rely on others, that is the king, to perform the necessary acts of restoring order to the kingdom. But she cannot win alone. She must lead a charge made up of her subjects. She agrees to lead her children to battle. The children wish to fight for their mother and make her king, but they also begin to fear that her growing power will trap them in childhood, as it will if she fails to arc into the king and instead slides into one of the negative archetypes. If she does not let them fight with her, as they demand, then she will become an obstacle to their growth into adulthood. But if she signals her own increasing shift from queen to king by not just allowing them to grow up, but challenging them to do so and to fight behind her, she will signify that her queen mother aspect will not hold them back. Indeed, her actions here not only signal her own shift from queen to king, but demands her children begin making their shift from maiden to hero. Second pinch point, children become adults. The children, in part inspired by the Queen's example so far, and in part galvanized by her remaining hesitancy, individuate from her. They wish to take responsibility for their own lives, to become subjects rather than children, although they do not yet fully understand the weight of this choice. They insist she claim the throne, even though this may mean she must eventually start meting out impartial punishment to some of them, in spite of her love for them, to maintain order. The third act begins with the false victory, protects her children. The Queen makes a deal that protects her children, but it is at the expense of their independence. It represents a failure of leadership in that she moves between negative archetypes, both the fearful and possessive love of the sorceress and the total control of the tyrant. Third plot point, kingdom in chaos. The Queen's attempt to protect her children without really assuming responsibility for leading them plunges the kingdom into chaos as the invaders breach the borders. Climax. Releases her children, accepts her crown. The Queen accepts that she must trust her children to embark on their own journeys and to play their own parts in protecting the kingdom under her guidance. She knowingly and willingly leaves behind the domestic world forever and takes her place as a true leader of the kingdom. Climactic moment. Kingdom is saved. Working together, the Queen and her subjects are able to push back the invaders and once again secure the borders of their kingdom. Resolution. Kingdom prospers. The king is dead. Long live the king. Having completed her arc, the Queen now ascends to the throne. No longer a parent, she is now a ruler. But her children are no longer children. They have grown up as well. The cycle of life continues, and under her wise rulership, the kingdom prospers. Now, here are some examples of the Queen arc, and you can find structural analyses for some of these by visiting the Story Structure database on my site. We have Elizabeth I in Elizabeth, Edna Spalding in Places in the Heart, George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, Joan in Joan of Arc, Harry Potter in The Order of the Phoenix, among others in the series, Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, Jackie Robinson in 42, Maximus in Gladiator, Dottie Hinson in A League of Their Own, Kay Graham in The Post, and Bob and Helen Parr in The Incredibles. So stay tuned. Next week we will be studying the King arc. Please stop by the site and tell me your opinions. Can you think of any further examples of stories that feature the Queen arc? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to help support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make Helping Writers Become Authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmwyland. Thanks so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.